Okay, so this is the key to section 2.6 part 1, and this is the key. In this worksheet we're talking about the algebra functions. So this is where we're adding two functions, subtracting two functions from each other, multiplying two functions, and dividing two functions, and we're actually getting a new function. So these two functions added together gives us a new function. These two functions subtracted from each other gives us a new function, and so on. So we can combine functions and get different functions. Now, when doing these, though, so I'm going to do the work on another sheet of paper, but in number 1A, you have that, let me do it here. So 1A, remember the definition. You have to know the definition of these. So g plus f at x, remember you read this as g plus f at x, is g of x plus f of x. And so g of x is this function here. All right, so that's x plus 5. So remember this is x plus 5. Plus f of x, which is this function here, so that's 4x minus 3. Okay, so all I did was in place of g of x and f of x, I substituted what those functions were equal to. And now remember, I put parentheses in there, but since we're adding, you really did not need parentheses. But some students do put them, and so I'm just going to put them just to remind you what to do next. So now you got to get rid of the parentheses. So to get rid of the parentheses, you have to, remember that's a 1 here, so you distribute the 1. That's a 1 here, distribute the 1. So 1 times x plus 5 is still x plus 5. And then 1 times 4x minus 3 is still 4x minus 3. And so when you combine like terms, I get x plus 4x is 5x, and then 5 minus 3 is a positive 2. So in the blank, you would put, in this blank here, right here, I'm going to do it here. In this blank here, you would put that g plus f at x is equal to 5x plus 2. So notice these two functions, when added together, gives us this function. Okay, number 2, 1b rather. So in 1b, you have this, you have g minus f at x. So again, remember when you subtract, the order does matter. So subtraction is not commutative. So the order does matter when you subtract. So the g must be listed first when you rewrite this. So this is g of x, subtract f of x. So just like we did this, we're going to put those in parentheses. Now, if you didn't put parentheses, just keep in mind that parentheses are going to be needed when you subtract this function. So you don't have to put parentheses around g of x. G of x is x plus 3. So you can just write this as x plus 3, but you do need parentheses here because you're subtracting all of those terms that make up f of x. So f of x, remember, is 4x minus 3. So not only are you subtracting 4x, but you're subtracting also a negative 3. All right, so now get rid of the parentheses. Remember, this is going to be a negative 1, or so you would distribute the negative 1, or you can think of this as adding the opposite. Subtracting this polynomial means adding the opposite. So if I add the opposite, I'm going to get x plus 3 minus 4x plus 3. So negative 1 times 4x is negative 4x. Negative 1 times a negative 3 is a positive 3. Combining like terms, x minus 4x is a negative 3x. A 3 and a positive 3 is also, well, is a positive 6. So for b, f minus g at x is going to equal negative 3x plus 6. Okay, f is where you multiply. Okay, not f, but c. C is where you multiply. So c, you have f times g at x. So by definition, this means f of x times g of x. That's what that means. Now you do need parentheses here in both of those functions, so you got to put both of those functions in parentheses. So f of x is going to be 4x minus 3. So in place of f of x, I'm going to substitute what it's equal to. It's equal to 4x minus 3. So right here, that's f of x. And then g of x, remember, is x plus 5 right here. So I'm going to replace g of x with x plus 5 in parentheses. Now I've got to multiply this out. So you multiply those two functions and you end up with a new function. Now remember though, to multiply these are two binomials, so I can go directly to the FOIL method. So 4x times x is 4x squared. The outer 4x times 5 is a 20x. The inner negative 3 times x is a negative 3x. And the last, a negative 3 times 5 is a negative 15. and then combine like terms, I get 4x squared. 20x minus 3x is 17x, and then minus 15. And so that is the new function for f times g at x. So f times g at x, you're going to put this trinomial there. So right here, you're going to say in the blank, you're going to say 4x squared plus 17x minus 15. Okay. Now in letter D, in letter D, you have g divided by f at x. All right, so let me go ahead and write this on here. So, so 1D, you have g divided by f at x. Okay, use the definition. By definition, that is g of x divided by f of x. All right, now g of x, remember, is this up here. So that's x plus 5. And f of x is 4x minus 3. Now, if you could factor, you would go ahead and factor, and you would divide out your common factors just like you did when you dealt with those rational expressions in a previous lesson. But there's nothing you can do there. So you can't factor, you're done. So that is g divided by f at x. All right, so the answer would be x plus 5 divided by 4x minus 3. All right, number 2. Number 2, we're dealing with two different functions now. We're doing the same kind of idea here. You're finding those combination of functions. So we're combining functions, but with different functions this time. Okay, so 2a. So 2a, notice I'm adding those two functions. So f plus g at x. You got to use the definition. Remember, that means f of x plus g of x. Okay, so f of x is 5x plus 1. So I'm going to replace that with 5x plus 1. G of x is 6 minus 5x squared. So 6 minus 5x squared. Combining like terms, and let's go ahead and put in descending order. So I'm going to put in descending order. That's going to give me a negative 5x squared plus 5x, and then 1 and 6 is 7. So I get negative 5x squared plus 5x plus 7. So that is the answer to 2a. So when you put the answer 2a, you should get negative 5x squared in the blank. Make sure you put the answer in the blank, minus 5x plus 7. Letter B is where you're subtracting. Okay, so this time you're going to say you want to find g subtract f at x. So g subtract f at x. Well, by definition, that means g of x minus f of x. Now, since you're subtracting, remember you're going to put this one in parentheses. So you're going to say minus that function f of x. So g of x, remember, is just 6 minus 5x squared. So that goes here. So that's this right here, 6 minus 5x squared. But you are subtracting f of x. f of x is 5x plus 1. Put that in parentheses because you're subtracting both of those terms. Not just the 5x, but the positive 1 as well. Now we're going to distribute the negative 3 here. So I'm going to get 6 minus 5x squared minus 5x. A negative 1 times 5x is negative 5x. A negative 1 times a positive 1 is a negative 1. And so combine like terms, and let's go ahead and put in descending order. I get negative 5x squared minus 5x. 6 minus 1 is a positive 5. And so I'm going to get over here, I'm going to get right here, so negative 5x squared minus 5x plus 5. All right. Letter C is where I'm multiplying those two functions. Okay, so let's go ahead and multiply them. So this is letter C. So letter C. Okay, so 2C. You're saying g times f at x. So by definition, remember that means g of x times f of x. That's what that means. Now remember, you got to put those in parentheses. So those do matter. You have to put in parentheses. So g of x, remember, is 6 minus 5x squared. So that's g of x. And then f of x is 5x plus 1. So in place of those two functions, I'm going to rewrite what that expression is. So g of x is 6 minus 5x squared times f of x is 5x plus 1. Now I've got to multiply this out. So notice those are two binomials, so I can use the FOIL method. So remember the FOIL, F-O-I-L. So 6 times 5x is 30x. 6 times 5x is 30x. The outer So that was the first. First times first. The outer, 6 times a positive 1 is a positive 6. The inner, a negative 5x squared times a positive 5x. Notice what I'm saying. A negative 5x squared times a positive 5x. A negative 5 times a positive 5 is a negative 25. X squared times x is x cubed. So that's so that'll be minus 25x cubed. And then the last, a negative 5x squared times a positive 1 is a negative 5x squared. And notice none of those terms are alike. They're all different. So I'm going to just go ahead and put them in descending order. So I'm going to put the x cubed term first. That's minus 25x cubed, then the x squared term, then the x term, and then your constant. All right, so that right here is going to go here. So those 4 terms, this polynomial is going to go here. So that's negative 25x cubed minus 5x squared plus 30x plus 6. And the next one, you want to find what f divided by g is at x. So f divided by g at x, so you're going to use the quotient rule there. Well, the definition of the quotient of two polynomials. So you're going to get f divided by g at x. So by definition, that is f of x divided by g of x. And so f of x is 5x plus 1. And then g of x, remember this is f of x, and this is g of x. So g of x is this, so that goes to the denominator. So g of x is 6 minus 5x squared. Now, I can't factor any of this, so then you're done. All right, so if you could factor, though, you factor to see if you can reduce any common factors. All right, so that would be the answer you would put in the blank. So that would be 5x plus 1 divided by 6 minus 5x squared. Okay, now number 3. Number 3, okay, you have these two functions. Now notice one's a binomial, it's linear, so this is a linear function, but this is quadratic. All right, now over here, this was linear, this was quadratic, and these two were linear. So these were two linear functions. These were, one was linear, one was quadratic, and same thing here, one's linear, one's quadratic. Now it says to show the work for this one, so we have to show the work for this one. You can see why. So let's go ahead and do 3a. So 3a, you want to find f plus g at x. So f plus g at x. By definition, remember f plus g at x, so you're finding the sum of those two functions. So f plus g at x is defined to be f of x plus g of x. And all you do is substitute those expressions in for your function. So f of x, remember, is this right here. It's 2x minus 3, and g of x is this. So in place of f of x, I'm going to substitute 2x minus 3. Plus, in place of g of x, I'm going to substitute negative 3x squared plus x minus 3. So that's what I substitute. Now, I didn't have to put this in parentheses because it was adding them. It did not matter. When you add, it does not matter if you put them in parentheses. Combine like terms, let's put them in descending order. So I'm going to put the squared term first, so negative 3x squared. Now the x terms, I can combine these two. 2x and an x is a 3x. And then my constant, a negative 3 and a negative 3, is a negative 6. So that goes into the blank for 3a. So that's 2x squared. Oops, sorry. Negative 3x squared. Negative 3x squared plus 3x minus 6. Okay, letter B. Let's look at letter B. So in letter B, you have, this time you have 3b. This time you have f minus g at x. So by definition, that means f of x subtract g of x. That's what that means. Now f of x, remember, is 2x minus 3. I don't need parentheses around here, but I need parentheses around g of x because you're subtracting this function. So I'm subtracting all of these terms. So I'm subtracting a negative 3x squared, I'm subtracting a positive x, and I'm subtracting a negative 3. That's what I'm doing. So you have to put that in parentheses. Now you can get rid of the parentheses, so you can distribute, and so you're going to get 2x minus 3. A negative 1 times a negative 3x squared is a positive 3x squared. A negative 1 times a positive x is a negative x. And then a negative 1 times a negative 3 is a positive 3. Combine like terms, and let's put in descending order. I get 3x squared. 2x and a negative x is a positive x. A negative 3 and a positive 3 is 0. So all you're left with is 3x squared plus x. So for 3b, you're going to put 3x squared plus x. All right, for c, you're multiplying those two functions. So let's just go ahead and do the work here for 3c. So for 3c, you want to find what f times g at x is. So f times g at x means f of x times g of x. Now now remember, you're multiplying two functions, so you have to put those in parentheses. F of x in parentheses will be 2x minus 3. G of x is this trinomial, negative 3x squared plus x minus 3. Now you're multiplying these two polynomials. Now you cannot use the FOIL method. Remember, the FOIL method only applies if you have a binomial times a binomial. That's not a binomial, that's a trinomial. So you have to use the distributive method, the distributive property. So basically what you're going to do is if you remember your lesson, is you're going to take each term of the first trinomial, the first polynomial. You're going to take each term of the first polynomial, you're going to multiply by the second. So each term multiplied by the second. All right, so first of all, it's going to look like this. You're going to say 2x times this second polynomial. So 2x times this whole thing, negative 3x squared plus x minus 3. And then minus 3 times the second one as well, negative 3x squared plus x minus 3. So again, the first term times the polynomial, the second term, negative 3 is the second term now, negative 3 times the polynomial. Okay? Now distribute this now, and distribute this. So get rid of the parentheses, so you can use distributive property, and you're going to get 2x times a negative 3x squared. 2 times negative 3 is a negative 6. X times x squared is x cubed. 2x times a positive x is a positive 2x squared. 2x times a negative 3 is a negative 6x. Over here, a negative 3 times a negative 3x squared is a positive 9x squared. A negative 3 times a positive x is a negative 3x. And a negative 3 times a negative 3 is a positive 9. Combining like terms, and let's put it in descending order. I'll put the cube term first. There's only one of those. Now the squared terms, 2x squared and a 9x squared is 11x squared. A negative 6x and a negative 3x is a negative 9x, and you're left with 9. And so that is the answer for 3c. So for 3c, you're going to put negative 6x squared plus 11x squared, I'm sorry, that's cubed, plus 11x squared minus 9x plus 9. So negative 6x cubed plus 11x squared minus 9x plus 9. Okay? All right, so that takes care of the worksheet for section 2.6, part 1.